Very good afternoon to all of you. I extend a very cordial welcome to all of you at the fourth day of ASSOCHAM 17th International Tax Conference. So we'll start from the first session on cross-border transaction, PMLA, black money, Benami and enforcement regime. It's a truly an honor and privilege for us to have the august presence of Honorable Dr. Justice Vineet Kothari, Madras High Court, as a session chairman for this session. Namaskar, sir. Sir, given the hectic schedule of yours, we are grateful to you for accepting our invitation for this important conference. Let me also welcome our other eminent experts as a panelist for this session. We have with us Shri Ashwini Taneja, advocate and ex-member Income Tax Appellate Tribunal, Dr. R.N. Dash, advocate and former acting chairman and member Appellate Tribunal for PMLA India and former DGIJ for India. We also have with us Shri Vineet Agrawal, co-chairman National Council on Direct Taxes ASSOCHAM and executive vice president and head of taxation GSW Group. We also have Shri Anshul Jain, partner in PwC, who will be moderating this session. Welcome to all of you, sir. Without taking much time, I would like to request Session Chairman, Honorable Justice Vineet Kothari ji, and Session Moderator Shri Anshul Jain to kindly take the things forward in this session.
Thank you, Avinash ji. I feel honored in being invited to be chairing the session, fourth session on the fourth day of 17th International Tax Conference. A distinguished panel is before you, learned audience, and by our discussion, I think you all would be benefited to a great extent. As you know, the session subject today is not only important for India, but on an international perspective also. We have all suffered and are going through the phase of COVID corona times the last 6 months, and all economies have taken a severe beating, and we all are in revival phase. Now in this session, we are about to discuss with the other experts with me on this panel the three important laws which Indian Parliament has enacted. Some of them were old laws, old wine in new bottle, and some are new laws which have been enacted with a very pious objective of checking the black economy, or number two economy as we say. Because as we all know, the benefits of the white economy should go to the people who deserve it, and the divide between the rich and poor can be reduced if we all shun away the black money and unproductive investments in the form of black money in unproductive assets. So these three enactments which we are going to discuss with the learned audience and with amongst ourselves, namely the Black Money Undisputed Undisclosed Foreign Income and Assets and Imposition of Tax Act 2015, Prevention of Money Laundering Act 2002, Benami Transactions Prohibitions Amendment Act 2016. So you can see these are 5 to 6 years old law, two of them, and 2002 Money Laundering Act is about 18 years old and adult now. But these enactments, friends, just to give you some few introductory words in the session, rest will be taken over by the experts. In my humble opinion, I'm a judge for the last 15 years now. In 3 high courts I've served, Rajasthan, Karnataka, and Madras. I'm now presently serving as J1. These acts, enactments, the implementation of these enactments is yet to take the full drive forward. And unless the constitutional courts in our country interpret the relevant provisions of these enactments, I think the true interpretation is yet to come. So as of now, it is all in the hands of the executive and bureaucracy of Enforcement Directorate and Income Tax Department to implement these enactments. Of course, the objective of these enactments cannot be questioned. The Parliament, in its own wisdom, has wisely enacted these laws to check, as I said, the evoked object of the corruption and the black money, given a go by, and to bring everything in the productive channels of the economy. And therefore, these the challenge to these enactments on their constitutional parameters will be a difficult challenge. But in various laws, our little experience in judiciary has been that laws are well-meaning, but the implementation is the problem. Either they overdo it or do not do it. Somewhere in between, the balance has to be struck. So as I've said, the ball is present in the court of the not judges or the constitutional courts, but the executive or bureaucracy, various departments, they have to be sensitized. They have to understand the not only the object of these acts, but to apply to the right to the correct objects or objects of taxation or the persons whom this law should be applied. Because the provisions of these enactments are very rigorous. The consequences of having black money now or money laundering, the concepts broadly we all know, are very, very severe. The Benami Law New Enactment 2016, you will see the name still used is Prohibition Amendment Act 2016. The old law of 1988 is still sought to be assimilated in the new enactment. So the other day when we were in some other webinar, the things discussed was whether this new law will apply to the old transactions of Benami acquisitions also. So this is a question to be seriously debated even now. But in my first blush reaction, I may say, not as a considered opinion, you should take it, is that applying this law even to the previous transactions prior to 2016 is also permissible in this law. Because after all, they will be investigating the holding of the property in the Benami names or ghosts, as one would say, is to reach the real owner and prevent him from claiming back that property so that the property can be confiscated and vested in the state. So the user of your corruption money or black money into acquisition of the property in the names of ghosts or other persons is lost. To provide for an effective check and disincentive for your number two money to go into the investments of this nature in the other names or third parties names or persons who do not really exist is to prevent, is to discourage this kind of investment. So the objective is obviously very good. Now the problem is, suppose this enactment is applied to a honest or bona fide purchaser who purchases the property for honest money, good money. Will his property be taken away by this new law? Will it be confiscated? Because he is in the chain of the acquisition of the property which was originally in a Benami name. That Benami name or ghost registers the conveyance deed in favor of a honest purchaser. What will be the fate of that transaction? So these are the questions which are yet to be tested in the courts of law. So there will be important questions for all of you to discuss also, because you as consultants, tax consultants and business people will have to be concerned with this law. Now, for the time being, let us have a look at the situation as present. Now, we are all economists recovering from a almost dead down position in the COVID times. So, should the rigorous implementation of these laws be put in a moratorium or a temporary stay, or should be not enforced with same rigor as it was intended to be put? On a lighter vein, I was thinking that to test these laws on the right touchstone, first use them against the politicians and bureaucrats. Please excuse me from saying so. But then if this law is put to these people, whom we all know in our country are not above the board people by and large as a class. There are good people everywhere. There are bad people everywhere. Black sheep is everywhere. So if you test them, you will know the law. You will know how it is implemented. You will know how it is tested, how it is challenged, and how it is interpreted by the courts. Therefore, the first and foremost question is not only analyzing the provisions of the enactments, but the integrity of the implementation. I am deliberately using the words integrity of implementation. A haphazard, a nonsensical, a arbitrary implementation and application of these laws can cause much more damage. Now we have to maintain a fine balance between the inflow of international investments, cross-border investments, cross-border transactions. No economy within its own shell can survive in today's global times. Now with the COVID times, I think the psyche of the countries and economies is changing drastically. Instead of looking outwards and cross borders, countries have started looking inside. Self-sustenance. As our government now says, Atmanirbhar. It's good to become Atmanirbhar, but can you survive very long for Atmanirbharta? So that is a serious question. Unless you open your borders, unless you go out for business, heavy imports and exports take place on prioritized items, you can't earn well. The question of taking out the black money and putting in with the state and then bringing it back in the productive channels of the economy or the country is another aspect. So the other serious question to be considered by all of us is what to do in the present COVID times when we all are trying to survive and come out of the COVID period, and serious problem of employment, serious problem of running of the industry, serious problem of bringing up the business. We all know several industries and business houses have taken a very serious beating in these times. So to allow them, if you create an atmosphere of the harsh application of these laws, as you know, Supreme Court is presently seized of the NPS declarations also. So they've extended the moratorium period up to 30th September now. So not that the courts are not aware of or not conscious to the current problems of the economies through PIL jurisdictions and through various kinds of writ petitions, fundamental rights, etc. Courts try to apply their mind and come as a savior to the various business houses and various economic aspects of the country also. But before the courts pronounce upon the right cases in right manner, we are more concerned with the business environment today. How to apply these laws, how to educate, sensitize the bureaucracy, the officers of the departments concerned to apply these laws more sensibly are, I think, the broad parameters in which we all should discuss these important topics and then try to evolve some kinds of guidelines which at least not only helps our consultant and professional brothers, but also gives the inputs to the wisdom of the government who can issue appropriate guidelines on official basis, so that like GST, time to time the government came to sort out the problems of the industry and trade to make it easy and simple to be implemented. Likewise, these laws should be applied to check really the spread of the black money and the Benami transactions or the properties and all this unproductive gold, etc. But the question is, if you give a wrong injection of medicine to a patient, he will not improve, he'll die or become more sick. It's something like this. So for us, chartered accountants, tax lawyers and tax advocates and some of the bureaucrats, we should really understand which medicine to be administered when and where and how much dose. This is the theme I want to set, I want to introduce. And as a judge, as a chairman of the panel, I think I have done my job to introduce the background of the theme and let experts discuss the details, nitty-gritty of all this. I'm sure the experts which you have on the panel will throw much better light on the fineness of these laws and application thereof, and will again be available for all your questions and comments also. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judge Kothari. Yeah, thank you, Judge Kothari. This is Anshul Jain. Thank you for laying out such a broad overview and laying out the context in which this entire session needs to be organized. I would now hand over to my co-panelist, Mr. Ashwini Taneja. He will take us through the broad overview of these three laws that Judge Kothari has mentioned, and he will help us understand the broad nuances and the basic parameters to be considered in these three laws. Over to you, Mr. Taneja.
Thank you, Anshul. And foremost, thanks to Honorable Justice Kothari for setting the ball rolling. And his company is always enriching. I had this privilege earlier also, that thereafter it becomes easy for us. The path he has shown, certain very important observations which he has made, and I would like to pick up some of them during the course of my deliberations, whether this patient needs antibiotic or the dose of vitamin. This is the biggest question which our entire country, our entire corporate world is asking today. If instead of vitamin, you infuse the dose of antibiotics or something like that, what will happen? That is, let us leave it aside. Thank you, Asucham, for organizing this program. It was need of the time. And as far as this law is concerned, economic laws, in fact, for that matter, any law, it has got either one of the objectives or maybe sometimes of both the objectives. That whether the objective is to maintain law and order, that is to regulate, or to strengthen something. So here the economic laws has also two objectives. Now, which one objective is the primary? That is for us to decide. That is for the government, our honorable government to decide. But it does carry two objectives. What are those? The first objective is, of course, to support the economy. The purpose of other laws may be something else. But as far as my and little understanding goes about the understanding the whole concept of economy, laws dealing with economic offenses or economic laws, the first purpose is to support the running of the economy. How the economy has to be streamlined, how we can make it robust economy. That is the first support mechanism. Then second is to regulate it and to punish the offender who is not letting the economy work in proper direction, punishing them and to regulating the economy. Now, it is a very, very careful and meticulous exercise which objective is to be chosen. I mean, I think lesser said the better. I mean, the things are clear at this time, what kind of objective should be the primary objective. Anyways, leaving that controversial debate, I mean, at that moment, because we have the benefit of presence of Dr. R.N. Dash also with his enriching experience, and maybe we get to hear something more on this issue. But as far as the laws are concerned, there are many economic laws which has been either freshly introduced or reintroduced by the present dispensation in our country. So it was not feasible so there to take up all of them. So therefore, we have chosen 3 or 4 of them only to be discussed primarily today. And the prominent one is Benami law. I will discuss the reasons why I consider it as a prominent one. And the second is, of course, anti-money laundering law, which has its global impact. And third is a recently introduced Black Money Act, which could not be understood properly so far, but its implications on the cross-border transactions and foreign investments is far-reaching. Though all these 4 laws will have impact, but this third one is going to really have a very, very deep impact. People have not even understood the implications, which some of them I will share with you. So I will give you a quick round of how these 3 laws are working, and thereafter maybe in the way Anshul would like us, we will proceed. So Anshul, would you permit me to share my screen so that I can share with the esteemed participants how the things are moving, how these laws we are going to deal with. So yes, thank you. Can you see on your screen the slides which I am sharing?
Yes, it is visible.
Yes, sir.
It is visible. Okay, all right. So in fact, the name which I have given to this my presentation is Interplays of Laws Dealing with Economic Offenses. There is a reason behind it, because the most difficult part which our corporate world is facing today, when these laws are put together and they have their impact, I mean, knowingly, unknowingly, it becomes unbearable. There is a concept of doctrine of proportionality. I think Honorable Justice Kothari would fast appreciate what I'm trying to say. Probably that doctrine of proportionality has been missed somewhere. I mean, in simple words, suppose a person has done some wrongdoing, wrongly or unknowingly, or because of fault in the system. So maybe on the scale of 1 to 10, his punishment should be, say, at the level of 4. But his punishment levels are far beyond even 10. So that is what our corporate world is facing today, our common man is facing today, because when these laws put together, they are combined together, the kind of effect they create is really, I mean, really beyond tolerance for anybody. So just to show how broad the canvas of these laws can be, which is beyond comprehension, I have put this slide before you. I saw this photograph in a newspaper where it was, it was mentioned that these chimpanzees were attached by Enforcement Directorate. I was astonished and amused also that how chimpanzees and Enforcement Directorate, there doesn't seem to be any connect. Yes, friends, that is the problem which is arising, that even the agencies are having their impact where there was not any connect, and the connect is taking place. Now, I will explain how these chimpanzees got to be attached by the Enforcement Directorate because of violation of environmental laws. That is wild protection law. That is one of the scheduled offense. So scheduled offense was committed. Chimpanzees were obtained by that concerned person by creating a forged document and a certificate, and also by making some violation of Wildlife Protection Act. And since scheduled offense was committed, the chimpanzees were held to be pursuits of that scheduled offense, that is pursuits of crime. And Section 5 of PMLA says pursuits of crime can be attached by the Enforcement Directorate. That is how these were attached. So I see the wide connect on the one hand, wildlife, and on the other hand, Enforcement Directorate is working. In the entire Corona period, only one department was most activated department amongst the all, not health, not any eateries or any primary services department. Enforcement Directorate was the most active department in the entire Corona period. You would have noticed day in, day out searches had taken place. Even whatever cases have been detected in the department, it did not derail their working. Whatever Corona cases kept increasing, but they are still working. It seems to be some primary objective. Government can explain it better why it is, so urgent need. There must be some reasons behind it. DASR also can throw some light on that. Another example case study which I have picked up, one distillery unit was set up somewhere in Rajasthan, and somehow some complaint was filed that it has discharged more water into the river, so it has committed some violation of Water Pollution Control Act. So Pollution Control Board filed some complaint against the unit. Thereafter, water treatment plant was set up, and the faults were removed. And in the meanwhile, ED came into action, and ED gave show cause notice for attachment of the factory. Now I thought, how Water Pollution Act, or where from this pursuits of crime came into picture. So the whole the basis of attachment was that since excess water was discharged into river, so say 50 KL was the capacity, 75 KL was discharged. That excess water represented extra production. So extra production means extra sales, and extra sales means extra profits. And profit has been infused into factory. So therefore, factory's show cause attachment was given for attachment of the factory. Somehow we could manage to get, after making humble prayer before the court, honorable tribunal, to get status quo. So 500 workers are there working. So somehow the status quo was maintained and factory was not attached. But that is how the laws are working. Nobody could have imagined that it will work in that fashion. So you would have read this news also, that Modi's Benami law has companies running for cover. Now, why it is so said so in the article? Because the companies did not expect even that Benami law can hit even the companies in such a fashion. When the Benami law was introduced, as Justice Kothari was saying, the law should be first tested on a particular class, which he made a mention. So it was perceived that it has been brought for that class only. But that class has been hit hardly 20%, and 80% the law is hitting is companies, that too listed companies, their promoter directors. Beyond imagination, something which we could not have imagined. I will explain in detail how it happened, and then Benami law has started. Then this important question Anshul was asking me yesterday, so I was ready with that, because this is the need of the time, that we should understand how these laws are working in coordinated manner. Because now the multi-agency scrutiny mechanism has been created by the government, that CBI ED action may now follow IT default props. IT means income tax, not information technology. So after income tax, the CBI ED, they will also work in tandem, and they will use the power of higher order data analytics. We are all aware about the power of data analytics technology today. So using this data analytics techniques and working in tandem, they are going to work. Then this is very important piece of information. You must have heard this, definitely this news, that Central Board of Direct Taxes has entered into an MOU on 22nd July 2020, during the period of Corona only, that they will have a regular exchange of information in a structured manner. So CBDT has entered MOU with SEBI, and CBDT has entered into MOU with MSMEs and few other organizations like that. It is continuing to have MOUs. So in structured manner, the information will be exchanged, and coordinating action will be taken hand in hand with all these agencies working together. Then, this interplay between these two acts, we can cover in detail after my overview is over, that how they will work. But this slide will show that Benami law is in the central position. I have kept in central position for a particular reason, because the findings of most of the departments are, wherever any violation will take place, some element of Benami law will be there. Violation of Benami law would be there, because the transactions would be done in some other name, pseudo names, host names, and some other names. So therefore, Benami law will be violated somewhere in some manner. Therefore, this law is going to have strong interplay with other laws. And the most important part of the Benami law is the section 67 and 67 clearly says, firstly, that this law is in addition to any provisions of any other law and not in subjugation thereof. Number one. Number two, that in case there is inconsistency in the provisions of this law or any other law, provisions of this law shall prevail over any other law. So therefore, there can be a cumulative effect also, meaning thereby, even if there is a violation of Income Tax Act, then tax payment will arise, tax demand will arise. And then if the transaction is Benami, then that property will be liable for attachment under Benami law also. And there are some other consequences to it. Similarly, with Companies Act also, suppose somebody has to explain the significant beneficial ownership concept. So under the significant beneficial ownership concept, there is one registered shareholder, other is the real beneficial owner of the shareholding. That needs to be explained to the company, to the ROC, registrar of companies under BEN 1 and BEN 2 forms. So if this kind of explanation is given, and if the transaction fits into the definition of Benami, then on the one hand, one is making compliance of the Companies Act, but on the other hand, it is a ripe case for hitting under Benami law. So, I mean, this is a very, catch-22 situation which many people are going to face. Similarly, under PMLA and Benami and Black Money Act and Benami also, there is going to be strong interplay, because if money laundering has been done, the chances are that the transaction has been done Benami also, and vice versa also. Then I have portrayed one examples. I can take it up later on, whereby I have shown that if a person does a particular offense, say smuggling, but by committing one offense, 10 number of other offenses are done unknowingly, by mistake, naturally, in a flow. So by doing smuggling, he will be committing violation of Customs Act first of all, then will also be committing offense under FEMA, then Black Money Act, maybe he may be stashing the money abroad, then he may be doing some in other names of Benami law also, then it is a scheduled offense, so therefore it will be hit under PMLA also. So, and if it is done by a company under corporate fraud, he may be held liable under the Companies Act also, 447 and 212(8) of Companies Act also. So, by doing one offense, many violations may take place. Now, what is the basic fundamental of Benami? How a transaction is treated as Benami? So, I will explain in 1 or 2 lines very quickly for the quick grasping of the things. Whenever there is a concept of duality, whenever duality pitches in, Benami pitches in. Now, what do you mean by duality? I will try to take, simile with our great epic, Gita, Srimad Bhagavad Gita. There, Shri Krishna has said that in our Indian epic, that we are one with the supreme power. So the problem arises when we become dual. Dual means we separate ourselves from the supreme power. So similarly, here also government says to teach us that you should live real life, not Benami life. It says if the legal ownership is divided into 2 parts, meaning thereby one is ostensible owner or the registered owner, and the other is the real owner enjoying the real benefits, the powers of real owner, then Benami law pitches in. Violation of Benami law takes place. So suppose consideration is paid by a person and the asset is held for his benefit by another person in the name of another person, then another person is Benamidar, and the person paying the consideration for whose benefit the property is held is the beneficial owner. So that is how instead of 2 persons, there will be total 3 persons, one seller, other beneficial owner, and another third person Benamidar. Otherwise, there would have been total 2 persons only, seller and buyer. When 3 persons come into picture, it becomes Benami. So there may be many factors leading to Benami, like to do fraud on creditors, like to do tax evasion. But the most important reason which has been noticed by the agencies is to make violation of certain civil laws, other laws. So, for example, to overcome the violation of SEBI law, to overcome the violation of, say, Ultra Urban Land Ceiling Act, to some provisions of Companies Act, or say, for example, Shah Rukh Khan's property was attached because the property was acquired in Alibag, where the property could have been acquired by the natives of that place only. So property was acquired in the company. So that is how the case of Benami was filed against that company owning that property. Then, there are many categories under which a property can be Benami. Even if the property is held in fictitious name, it will be Benami. If the person is not aware of the knowledge of the ownership, is not aware about that he is the owner or where from the consideration has come, then also it can be Benami. Then when the payer of the consideration is not traceable or is fictitious, then also it can be Benami. Then interplay. Now, with regard to interplay of Benami with Income Tax Act, I will be touching upon some issues which has direct bearing on the cross-border transactions also. So firstly, I will touch upon how the interplay between the Indian Income Tax Act and Benami law will take place. So far, in case a person was not able to explain the nature and sources of amount of loan or share capital received by it, the only implication was the tax demand could have been raised. But now that kind of transaction could be treated as Benami also, and the underlying assets can be attached also. The other important implication which is going to take place is now that suppose the GAR is invoked, or by after invoking, say, general anti-avoidance rule, or by invoking PPT test, principal purpose test, say treaty benefit is denied, then also the provisions of Benami law can be attracted. That will be more clear with the help of this slide if you see. So I will try to explain how an action is attempted by an officer in this particular case. There is one judgment in the name of AB Mauritius. And if you read that judgment, the facts were that there was one US company which, instead of making investment directly into the Indian company, routed its investment through the Mauritius company. And more. Course of proceedings, it was that Mauritius company or Singapore company were just paper entities, and the entire control was held by US company. So they were not doing any substantive business. So eventually they were held as known entities. So the one consequence is directly under Income Tax Act, but the other consequence will also arise under Benami Act also, Prohibition of Benami Property Transactions Act 1988. Its name has been kept at 1988, suffix is 1988, not 2016, though it has been substantially amended in 2016. So the immediate implication under Benami law can be that the person, that the Mauritius entity can be treated as Benami entity, and the entity which is controlling the shares, that is US company, can be treated as beneficial owner, and the underlying asset in India, that is the shares, can be treated as Benami asset. So Benami law does not extend to the properties located outside India. For that, we have got Black Money Act. But assets located in India, even if the transactions are done by non-residents or foreign residents or foreign nationals, still the provisions of Benami law can be attracted and properties can be attached. So now invoking of GAR or PPT trust and denying of treaty benefits may have far-reaching complications now. Now this slide I have opened to explain that now Companies Act requires furnishing of information under these norms and popularly known as significant beneficial owners disclosure under BEN 1, BEN 2 forms. But if this information is furnished, it is quite possible that a case may fall into the category of violation of Benami law also. So that is something to be taken care of properly. Now this another example which I want to quote is of a non-resident Indian. As we know that non-resident Indians are not allowed to acquire land in some areas. For example, agricultural land, they are not allowed to acquire legally. So in case a non-resident acquires land in the name of his friend or in family or is in family member who does not come into the exempted category, then the friend holding the land on behalf of a non-resident, if the full payment has been made by non-resident and the property is held in such a manner that he exercises the control of the owner, then the Indian person holding the asset in India may be treated as Benamidar, non-resident as beneficial owner, and the land can be attached. And in some cases, it has already been attached. So prosecution will take place of this person. Then the other consequences, property is liable to attachment and subsequently under confiscation of the property with the central government. Then prosecution of the persons, that is Benamidar and beneficial owner, and also person who has abetted. And then third is also there could be a possibility of imposition of fine and imprisonment of up to 7 years. So money laundering, offense of money laundering. What is money laundering? Basically, we sometimes confuse it with conversion of black into white. So normally black into white is only tax evasion. When we talk about money laundering, it is a global concept. When a scheduled offense is done, a crime is done, and money is earned from earning that crime, and that money so converted is mixed up with good money, or it is portrayed as good money, legit money, then the offense of money laundering can be said to have taken place. So not from black to white, maybe from red to white, then it is money laundering. And there are 3 stages I have already explained. That firstly, there will be commission of crime, then generation of proceeds of crime, and then by commission of money, by laundering, by placement, layering, and integration. Then this we can skip for the time being. And then what makes it more harsh, this concept of money laundering worldwide, it is a global phenomena, is that there is a reverse burden of proof on kind of concept. That normally the principle which is followed is that a person is innocent unless proved guilty, and burden to prove guilty is the person who is alleging him to be guilty. But here there is a partial reverse burden kind of proof concept, that it will be presumed that a person is charged or alleged to have done the offense of money laundering, that then the burden will be upon him to prove that he has not done the offense of money laundering. That is what it makes it very harsh. So this slide, which I have opened before, is the most prevalent example in our country particularly, and this may be there in other countries also. Wherever the bank defaults takes place, default in repayment of the bank loans, then what happens? The FIRs are filed by the bankers that the loan was obtained fraudulently or some siphoning of a fund was done. Then the entire amount of loan is treated as proceeds of crime. So not only that, borrower comes into problem. Wherever the borrower has used that money, all the entire channel comes into problem. So that is why I say that really these economic offense laws have far-reaching implications than one could have imagined. So even if the banker has that the borrower has dealt with a company, say foreign company, any non-resident company, whosoever has used that pursuits of crime, all they are liable for action under this law. So very briefly, I will explain Black Money Act also within 2 minutes. In nutshell, this law says that there shall be charged on every assessee with effect from first day of April 2016 a tax in respect of his total undisclosed foreign income and asset of the previous year at the rate of 30% of such undisclosed income and asset. Meaning thereby, even at any time during the previous years, say maybe in 50 years, irrespective of length of time, if there are some assets which are undisclosed foreign assets, or there is an income which is earned by a person subsequent to this period, which is undisclosed foreign income on which tax has not been paid in India, then such income is liable to tax, and such assets, value of such assets is liable to tax at the rate of 30% and penalty at the rate of 90%, aggregating to 120%, in addition to prosecution, imprisonment, etc. So thank you very much with regard to this. I know I have exceeded a little bit of time, but these laws are such that I could not have squeezed more than that. Thank you very much. And now we can take up the issues further.
Thank you, Mr. Dhameja. Really appreciate the detailed overview that you have given. I'll request a couple of more minutes for you. So to start with, let me pose you the most difficult question that we have. On a very generic level, I think while on independent level, all these laws need to be kept in mind while you're doing a cross-border transaction. And there is always an interplay of these three laws. How do you see the interplay impacting a cross-border transaction? And do you see that these three laws can simultaneously impact a transaction which practitioners or companies should keep in mind while they're doing a cross-border or inbound or an outbound transaction?
In fact, very good question has been raised by you, Anshulji. I don't know whether how many people of us are aware that nowadays many financial institutions have starting getting earlier they used to do only due diligence. Now they have started getting the AML audit done, anti-money laundering law audit, with respect to any borrowers as well as investor. So even if an investor approaches a financial institution, they will get its AML audit done. First of all, you tell us that your funds are not slush funds or any illegit money which you are infusing to us. Similarly, if any borrower, with regard to borrower, how they are using the money, what money they are already having, whether it is he is mixing the good money with bad money, etc., whether he is committing any scheduled offense or not. There is a long list of scheduled offenses. As I said, scheduled offenses list is so long. Any possible violation is covered therein. Many sections of Indian Penal Code, Prevention of Corruption Act, theft, forgery, dacoity, smuggling, violation of Companies Act, violation of Customs Act, violation of Black Money Act. Many laws have been covered there, number one. Number two, it may be possible that the transaction which a corporate is willing to do, that property which they are going to acquire is a money laundered asset or is a Benami asset, or on which there is some violation, the assessee who was owning has done some violation under Black Money Act, or the payment which is being made from foreign sources, the undisclosed asset of a resident. He is non-resident now, but at that time he was resident. So, from all possible angles, one has to view that what could be possible violations under this law. So there is definitely a strong interplay, and the most agonizing part is that they have cumulative effect. It is not that if one law has taken its effect, other law will preclude, or there is a situation of mutual exclusive. No, there is no exclusivity at all. There is rather cumulative effect. So I have seen the attachments happening. First of all, income tax department will immediately claim the attachment. Then on the top of it, Benami law department will claim the attachment. And then ED has also made the attachment. And when the courts ask me why, what is the need of 3 attachments? Then the reply is, sir, suppose he escapes under one law. I mean, he proves that he has not done violation under that law, but he has done violation under this law. So he has to satisfy us also that he is not a violation. So there is definitely a strong interplay and far-reaching implications now.
Have you seen in your practical experience, Ashwini ji, any practical example of Benami law or any of these laws are impacting a cross-border transaction? Maybe on a no-name basis, if you can just illustrate for our audience's benefit.
Recently, I saw one case where a company was dealing into bitcoins. Now, Bitcoin at that time when it started was not said to be neither legal nor illegal. In some companies, in some countries, it has been legalized. Some countries have not yet taken stand. So therefore, the company was invested trading into Bitcoins, having many investors. So it did partnerships, collaboration with foreign residents also, the international companies also. They also infused funds. But eventually, what happened? Two things happened. First of all, some defaults were done. So FIRs were filed all along the country against that company. Not only that, thereafter the government has also come out with some legislation. RBI has come out with some legislation now, and Parliament is also has passed the act or is going to pass that legislation. I think Dashab is more updated on that subject. We had a discussion on that. So eventually, what happened? Not only the main management of the company came into trouble, all good their material investors, those who are working closely with the management, they are also facing the prosecution. So I mean, many problems came suddenly. I'm in this manner. So I mean, there are many such examples which we can keep on quoting, Anshulji.
Thank you, Mr. Taneja. Dr. Tash, I mean, considering the examples and the overview that Mr. Taneja has given and the practical example he has provided, do you think these issues have cropped up because the law is followed too strictly, or I mean, when we say law is followed strictly in the letter, or somewhere while implementing or interpreting the laws, the spirit is missed? I mean, what is your reaction, Dr. Tash, on this?
Thank you very much. The regulations that we have, both in form of laws and rules, are primary vehicles by which government implements its policy and objectives. What are the objectives of securing economic growth, keeping it safe from economic predators? They are these laws which are often sometimes called draconian, sometimes called too strict, sometimes also are implemented rigorously, and I think they should be, but they provide rules of the game for all of us citizens, even for government, for businesses, civil society. We forget that these laws also provide the rules of the game for the free enterprise, for its growth, creation, growth, and prosperity, and also contains it also. Therefore, the regulations are to be strictly implemented. Let us recall in 2008, when economic crisis came. Why did it come? It came because of the regulatory failures. And we don't need another one now. And also let us take the example of New York. After 2008, they opened the floodgates of investment into New York. Bloomberg was the mayor till 2014. All kinds of money, color, black, red, whatever it is, Bermuda, Seychelles, all kinds of destinations. Those came, invested in property in Manhattan, and now it is a headache for the law administering authorities that all those properties are idle for 10 months in a year. So it is regulations are absolutely necessary. But let me tell you, the regulations are not also a costless affair. In case of our country, particularly, where litigations are expensive and much time taking, Honorable Justice Kothari will bear me out. Even if we had these laws from 2002, he was candid enough in admitting that judicial pronouncement has not come in most of the controversial issues. So the cost is enormous to citizens and enterprises, to economy, and even to government. Government also, because of this too much of a regulation, has a bad reputation also, which none of us like. I find that certain regulatory practices have created unintended costs these days, like Mr. Taneja now called. I am seeing every day it is happening, and both investments inbound and outbound are affected by it. One investor brought in some money for a project investment in India, and what happened? He he was supposed to bring in a X quantity of money, but the Indian partner, which is a government, a state government, could not provide its share. So he had to bring in extra money to complete the project on time. Project was completed on time, but he has not been allowed to take back the extra money he brought in, and instead now he is facing ED hit. So these are unintended consequences of the laws which we need to really look into, because certain aspects of law become outdated, certain aspects of law become inconsistent with the policy that we are supposed to follow. So they need to be really checked, amended, and corrected often. And more often, the implementational issues create greater hassles than the laws by themselves. Honorable Justice Kothari correctly told, the integrity of investigation is required so that all these cases should be handled properly. So what I want to add there, in addition to integrity of investigation, harmonious implementation with the policy objective is required. That is what is the call of the day. Thank you very much.
Understood, sir. Thank you. Very well, nicely explained. One question that I have been frequently asked by many of my clients, and I'll take your inputs, Mr. Agrawal, on this. I mean, what do you think? Whether the Benami law is applicable only on the individual transactions or transactions vis-a-vis the promoters or directors, or does the Benami law also applies to business transactions which are done by assets which are held by listed companies or unlisted companies? I mean, is it applicable across the board, or is it only for individual focused and individual specific law? Mr. Agrawal, your views?
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Anshul. I understand this Benami law is applicable for all. Basically, it is widely understood that Benami law has been brought in to check, as Justice Kothari said, a particular class where we can test it. But that is a very limited class. And in fact, when you start testing this law in letter, I would not say spirit, but if you start testing it in letter, it is applicable to all classes of individuals or companies or artificial juridical persons. So, and in fact, if you see, if actually an authority wants to implement in a very narrow sense, most of the listed entities or corporates may own their assets in the name of their employees. And we have seen cases where the long hand of law has reached there, which was not warranted. So of course, we need to be very, and we need a lot of code and interventions in such cases. Thank you.
Understood. Understood. Thank you. Coming back to you, Mr. Taneja, can you narrate some of the case studies where a business organization has been hit unaware or unknowingly for a transaction which was done in the regular course of its business? I mean, does these law impact? Have you any practical examples of these laws impacting such normal course transactions also?
Yes, Anshul. In fact, what has happened in last couple of years, what I have witnessed is whosoever businessman has come to me for consultations. I mean, by meeting them, I have found that they did not even imagine. It is not that they have knowingly done a mistake. They did not imagine, okay, in this manner, this kind of violation has been done. So to give, for example, I will begin with Benami and how Benami law has really affected them so badly. So, for example, whenever a large size business organization builder in the construction industry to build up, say, big colonies or residential complexes and commercial complexes, would need a huge land bank. And to collect the land, it will, deploy some companies, depute some companies so that the land could be purchased from the market at nominal rates, etc. and in a proper manner, unhindered manner. Now, such kind of land aggregating companies have been held to be Benami because on the ground that these companies are holding land not as the owner in their own capacity, but they are owning the land on behalf of the major infrastructure company. So their entire land have been attached. In one case belonging to Bombay, 2,000 acres have been attached, and they have been treated as Benamidar and the infrastructure company as beneficial owner. Now, similarly, in the case of, as Viniji was indicating, in the case of some listed companies also, now shares are held sometimes in a group, in the consortium of group. Sometimes the registered shareholders are some other persons and the real beneficial owners are some other persons. I mean, for whatever reason it has been done, but that has also been treated as Benami. Then loan transactions, the most hitting part has been wherever loan transactions have been treated as ingenuine. So on the one hand, taxes have been paid. On the other hand, these have been treated as Benami also, these transactions. So it has really hit very badly. And coming back to Black Money Act. Now under Black Money Act, we perceive that if there is some undisclosed foreign asset or undisclosed foreign income, only that will be covered. But there are certain things, if we read between the line. So for example, since there are proper disclosure norms which are required. So recently I got a call from one of my colleague chartered accountant. He was saying that after survey done on the company, that the company did not make proper disclosures in its income tax return with regard to the interest which it has with regard to the subsidiary companies overseas. So holding company has to properly disclose financial interest in the income tax return. Since it was not disclosed, it is a case of non-disclosure, and non-disclosure it is itself an offense under section 41, 42, 43, etc. of Black Money Act. And then other consequences are also there of payment of taxes, etc. So penalties, taxes, all are there. Similarly, under PMLA also, which I mentioned, for example, even environmental lapses. I mean, nobody could have, imagined that environmental lapses done knowingly, unknowingly, negligence, whatever reasons will lead to this extent that it can invite even attachment of factories. Then any kind of corporate fraud. I mean, maybe bank loan taken, some irregularities were noticed once it becomes defaulter, or some other kind of fraud, or any attraction of Prevention of Corruption Act. For example, we have parallel laws of FATCA and all that. Here it is if any violation of Prevention of Corruption Act or any violation done by the company which it covered under IPC, under any section of IPC or under any other law, which is a scheduled offense, is really hitting very hard. Or non-residents doing some transactions which they were not aware, they were very permitted, they have done transaction to comply the law in a way that since only residents should have. When I asked that non-resident person that why did you do this, he said only residents can buy the land, so therefore I requested my friend to buy land. So that is why he purchased
Understood.
land.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Understood. Understood. Thank you, Mr. Taneja.
Yes, sir.
Justice Kothari, I wanted to bring this question back to you since it requires some sort of an interpretational aspect, sir. I think there is a well-established concept of a bona fide buyer. Under Benami laws, how is this concept dealt with, sir? And do you think a bona fide buyer also get a protection or his properties is liable for attachment or confiscation, and he's also liable for fine and prosecution under these laws?
Thank you for the question, Anshul. Basically, being a bona fide buyer is a question of fact. So it will have to be established with cogent and proper evidence that you are a bona fide buyer unaware of the Benamidar transferring the property to you. I can draw your attention in answer to this question to section 41 of the Transfer Properties Act, the general law, which says, I'll just read the relevant part of it, transfer by ostensible owner. It says that where the ostensible owner transfers the property to a person for consideration, the transfer shall not be voidable on the ground that the transferor was not authorized to make it, provided that the transferee, the bona fide purchaser, after taking reasonable care to ascertain that the transferor has power to make the transfer, has acted in good faith. So this is the basic requirement of a purchase being a bona fide purchase. You will have to establish as a fact that you have taken good care to ascertain the background of the transferor. If you are aware that he is a Benamidar and is not a apparent or ostensible transferor only, section 41 will not save you. Now this 41 has become subject to section 27 of the new 2016 Benami Prohibition Act, which subsection 2 again I'll wish to draw your kind attention to. That section 27(1) provides for confiscation of the Benamidar properties, Benami properties. Then subsection 2 carves out an exception for the honest purchasers or bona fide purchasers. It is like this. Nothing in this subsection 1 shall apply to a property held or acquired by a person from the Benamidar for adequate consideration prior to issue of the notice under subsection 1 of section 24 without his having knowledge of the Benami transaction. So two conditions. You should prove your bona fides. You should prove that you had no knowledge of this being a Benamidar property. Plus, the transaction should have taken place before the notice under section 24 of the new enactment has been issued with respect to that property. If you fulfill these parameters and establish this as a fact, possibly the Benami, the honest, the bona fide purchaser may have an excuse even under the new amended law. But as I said, honesty is never sought to be punished by courts. No law can even punish the honest people. Otherwise, it will be struck down on the anvil of the constitutional parameters. But honesty has its own price. You have to pay that price by proving these facts as a question of fact. If you have done that, there is still a saving grace in the new amended law, because the law is intended to hit bad people, bad money. So honest bona fide purchasers can have their savings provided they fulfill these twin conditions. Not knowing that he is Benamidar before 24(1) notice, and then for adequate consideration. If you do that, possibly you are saved. That is the answer. Thank you.
Understood. Understood. But then, on one hand, this is the concept of buyer, but then there is another concept of fruits of a poisonous tree or proceeds of crime.
Yes.
Now, in
there
sorry,
not, because the concept of PML is slightly different from Benami Law Section 27. That is the proceeds of crime. If the money has originated from crime, including fraud, then you are not safe. Then howsoever bona fide you may be, since you are acquiring a property which is the out of crime money, it is a tainted transaction, you may not be safe. So it will be bona fide versus crime. And state's duty is to punish crime, prevent crime. Therefore, there you will not be saving. It's a normal economic transactions Benami which can be possibly saved.
Understood. Mr. Taneja, coming back to you, do you have any practical illustrations of how these two arguments are interplayed and how the regulators or at the time of implementing these or analyzing these transactions, how do they analyze fruits of poisonous tree or proceeds of crime? And should a bona fide buyer actually be concerned with that before entering into a cross-border transaction, as Justice Kothari rightly mentioned, Mr. Taneja?
Actually, Anshul, I am really thankful you are raising this issue. And I mean, fortunately, we have the benefit of presence of the Honorable Justice Kothari, who can be in a better position than him to understand the plight of the people of this country. I will explain some of them, and maybe our voice reaches through courts also to the government, or at least the honorable courts are able to save wherever we are. Many people are stuck, I mean, unknowingly and beyond proportions. Now, Honorable Justice made a mention very aptly of Section 41 of TPA. But, my lord, the problem which we are facing is these other laws, specific legislations, every enactment make a mention that this law is supreme. So it will have supersession effect on the other laws. So therefore, they even tend to override 41 also, because they create their own realm of legislation. So, for example, as you rightly pointed out, Section 27 of PBPT Act is there. Since 27 is there, specific legislation is there, it overrides 41. So we have to forget 41 for the time being. I mean, pardon me if I am not able to speak the correct principles of jurisprudence, but that is how the authorities are doing.
Just one intervention, Ashwini ji.
Sir.
The non-obstante clause which you are mentioning, that it overrides. The non-obstante overriding is only always, in my humble understanding, to the extent of repugnancy.
Yes, my lord.
The law or the previous law is repugnant to the specific later law. The later law will prevail if it contains a non-obstante clause. As I've tried to show, Section 41, second part, and 27(2) of the new law can be read harmoniously to save the honest transactions. There is no conflict of the two. So you can't forget 41 second part.
Yes, very right.
Because repugnancy only will be undone. That is my understanding.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And working on these guidance, we have got some relief also latestly from Honorable Tribunal of PMLA, a very good detailed judgment written by Honorable Justice Manmohan Singh. It is on the site, available on the site, and widely published also. But I wanted to make out one point here which the people are going to face, and that was faced by that particular person also. Now, since we have to read Section 27, so we have the case has to fit in within the parameters of 27. And for fitting into 27, two things, as rightly mentioned. First of all, there should be adequate consideration, and that there should not be any knowledge. So first question arises, it is whose burden to prove these two conditions? So very controversial issue arose. But fortunately, Honorable Tribunal has held that it is the burden of the IO. He has to say that he has knowledge, and he has to say consideration is not adequate. Otherwise, the IO had shifted the burden to the person, to the accused. You prove the reverse. Number one, somehow we have come out of that. I don't know whether this view will be consistently adopted by all the courts or not. Number one. The major problem is it also puts another condition which says that it should be prior to issuance of notice under Section 24(1). Now, most of the cases which we are having is property is purchased by me, say, for example, from Mr. X. Now, once I have purchased the property, it is quite possible that Mr. X may be slapped with the notice later on. Or it is also possible that the notice has already been issued upon Mr. X, which I was not aware of, and he has sold the property to me without my knowledge. In that case, it clearly says that such kind of transactions are void. So this is the most risky proposition for anybody before doing any transaction, whether it is resident or non-resident. Before making a transaction, he has to be doubly sure that on this property, no notice under Section 24 has been issued. And there is no mechanism to know. There is no formal mechanism to know about it. It may not be even pasted in the registrar, sub-registrar's file. So for that, there is a lacuna. This kind of situation has been left omitted to be taken care of, and people are suffering because of that.
That is where the question of integrity of implementation will arise. If there is a long gap between the two, 24 notice and 27(2) proceedings, then the SSC or the person concerned can definitely question what you were doing all this time. Suddenly, after so many years, you come down on my head and say, no, 24 was issued 5 years back. If you are not aware, we can't help you. That is why if the burden is rightly cast upon the investigating officer, he has to establish that why all this time was taken. There, the chance of success is still there. But you are right. This gap is
This
painful.
gap, yes.
Gap is painful, and it has to be filled up by some legislative thing or by court.
Yes, yes, sir.
I'm
Secondly,
really glad. Sorry, Mr. Daneka.
no, you can cover. I want to speak 2-3 lines only on this topic.
Yeah,
Then you
please,
can
please.
Secondly, with regard to pursuits of crime, sir, the major problem we all are facing is that for a person it could be pursuits of crime. Say, for example, one company corporate has taken loan from a banker, and that loan has been found to be or alleged to be obtained not through proper regular channels, through maybe furnishing some irregular documents, certificates, etc., and it is held to be regular loan and accordingly held to be pursuits of crime under the law. But if that corporate has dealt with some other person, say from that corporate property has been purchased by another corporate, which could be a foreign company also. So how that property can be treated as pursuits of crime in that company? There is in the hands of that person, other person, because there is no specific provision on the lines of section 27 under PMLA. So in absence of any clear parameters, people like the cases, the published cases, which I can quote the names also, Kiran Majumdar case, which is decided by the tribunal, and probably Karnataka High Court has, I don't know, decided or not. Honorable Karnataka High Court I am not aware about that. But in Kiran Majumdar's case, what had happened? She simply purchased a flat from a company belonging to Vijay Mallya Group, Kingfisher Group. So she paid full payment through installments, proper channel, whatever amount it was, 10 crore, 20 crore, and she had full proof. Still thereafter, she had to do Shasan. She had to do ups and downs to get the relief from the tribunal. She had to suffer a lot. And then finally, the tribunal gave a relief, that too after detailed arguments, after passing detailed order. No, she is a bona fide buyer. She has obtained the property for a valued consideration. And n number of arguments were made by the ED. So, I mean, this thing needs some clarity in the law, and maybe some reading down by the honorable courts or proper explanation from the court. Income tax law has fortunately evolved to a great extent, but PMLA law has not evolved since 2002. I don't know what are the reasons. The reasons may be many. We can explain and discuss at length of time, but that has not evolved from the courts. So therefore, people are suffering. That is what I wanted to say here in this case.
Understood. So I'm glad that we're talking about the integrity of implementation, and we're talking about concepts of adequate consideration and no prior knowledge. I think the important factor is, and that is where I want to bring Mr. Agarwal in, when we talk about these concepts and we talk about a bona fide buyer or fruits of poisonous tree and proceeds of crime, a classic example that comes to my mind is a statutory protection, which is already provided under Section 32A of IBC. Where a bona fide buyer can acquire the property and is not charged, neither the buyer nor the assets of the corporate debtor are charged for any issues of the erstwhile promoters or any issues of money laundering or any such criminal laws pre-CIRP commencement date. Now, do you think Section 32A of IBC gives priority to a resolution applicant under IBC, or do you think the enforcement agencies would still be able to take control over them? I mean, what is your view, Mr. Agarwal?
Let me go to the fundamental of this entire issue. The fact remains that we are a litigation society. Okay, this morning only I was reading in newspaper that Honorable Supreme Court again came heavy on the government authorities, that what kind of litigations mean. There is no let go on litigations. I mean, the laws are made to make life simple. As we started, that laws are made to help the economy, and secondary purpose is to regulate the economy so that the real fruit of the economic growth goes to the deserving one and the bad apples fall apart. Now, what happens, when we say there's an interplay of laws, all laws work in their different domain, and interplay of laws comes to help each other, not to fight with each other. So let me start with the basic, because we have some our international audience also, before coming to this IBC issue. I mean, what we are doing actually under RBI guidelines, if a foreign investor wants to make investment in a company in India, there is a basic price at which he can come and invest in India, because that's how the valuations are done. Now, Income Tax Act says you cannot invest from lesser than a particular price, otherwise it will be treated as gift. Then there comes an issue of premium, that what kind of premium should be there. If the premium is more than a merchant banker determined premium, then again there is a taxability comes in. Fourth, if the premium is more than the market premium, because see, two parties negotiate with each other, Market knows each other. Nobody will invest more than what is deserving. No merchant banker can guide two independent parties, negotiation of two independent parties. But then if the premium is more than the, and especially in the case of cross-border transaction, then there's a round tripping issue comes in. So the authorities have to understand, they have to go through what a commercial transaction means. Whether, as Justice Kothari has rightly said, that intention has to be checked. Okay, now coming to this IBC, whether the IBC, the whole purpose of IBC is to let the industry flourish, let the employment continue, the bad apple, the bad promoters go out, a new person takes in, so that there's a continuity in the business. Now there may be some past wrong things which might have happened, both civil faults as well as criminal faults. Okay, civil faults are taken care by a series of amendments which have happened in the IBC, which is Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Now it is clear that related parties have to move out. The promoters have to move out. Even the related parties cannot come in. And all the past civil defaults are taken care at the time of resolution. Then what will happen to these old criminal liabilities? The Honorable Supreme Court in SR case has already told that the new buyer who comes with clean hand, he wants a clean slate. Now the Hydra heads cannot keep on popping up. Okay, this is a classic sentence Honorable Supreme Court has stated in that case. But what's happening? I mean, I'll not name the case. In one of the cases which has now reached Supreme Court and one of the top 12 cases which were initially taken by RBI, the very assets which are subject matter of those loans which are under insolvency right now and which have been assumably siphoned off, to punish those loans, siphoning of those loans, Enforcement Directorate has stepped in and attached those assets. Now, just tell me which buyer will take over this toxic asset with an attachment taint. Now, Ashwini Saab has already told this thing that the taint is not on the asset. Once a good money comes and pays off for those assets, the taint has gone with the money which is there. The taint has been removed. But this has to be understood. Section 32A has very well come. It is giving protection. But as rightly we are a litigation society, the litigation is still continuing. Honorable Finance Minister has told on the floor of the House that IBC is to resolve the businesses. We will not go after the genuine buyer. Now, if a transaction has been tested through NCLT, through NCLAT, through the entire process of resolution under IBC, which is a law passed by Parliament of this country, can there be more test to the genuineness of the person? Still, we are litigating in the courts. That shows that things are not right or the laws are not being implemented in the right direction. Thank you.
I agree. In fact, when you highlighted about the issues of Hydra heads popping up, I mean, that reminds me of many matters that we are doing under insolvency. Unfortunately, the tax authorities still continue pursuing these matters as contingent liabilities in the corporate debtors. And despite the resolution applicants paying monies to the COCs and settling and buying companies out of IBC, still they have to take care of the contingent liabilities. And that head, I don't know whether it is a Hydra head or is it a hanging sword, but that sword keeps on hanging on the resolution applicants. At least that is one cause of concern for almost all the transactions that we are doing. That brings me to my last question, and I know we have already overshot the time. I'll just quickly run through these questions because this is relevant in the current market scenario, where companies are grappling with the financial stress, and more foreign investors or strategic partners are looking at these companies. How do you think these laws would impact such transactions? Mr. Taneja, in your view, especially in cases where these white knights, as we call them, they use structures like ARCs to invest in the stressed assets. Now, on one hand, the intention is very genuine. I mean, they want to resolve the stress. They want to provide the much needed capital to either the banks or to the companies to help them move out of the stress position. But then how do you think the investors should treat their steps while structuring these transactions? I was reading one of the recent news article where the RBI is investigating on these ARCs and how these ARCs should be. I mean, are these ARCs used as a conduit for these for acquiring assets by the foreign investors? I mean, do you see these are real concerns for regulators under these Benami laws or PMLA? How do you practically see all of this, Mr. Taneja?
Mute. Unmute yourself.
Mr. Taneja, you are on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Yeah. So I will divide the answer of this question into three parts. A very, very important question. It is a question of the day, in fact, and before the entire corporate world, this question we are in. Firstly, what should be done by the investor? Secondly, what should be done by the government and the regulator? And what should be the response of the court? As far as investor is concerned in the present scenario, I think investor has to be very, very cautious. Investor has to doubly check, is to evolve new technologies to find out that the whatever transaction they are going to enter into is not hit by any of these laws, knowingly or unknowingly, in whatever manner. Even if we want to take risk, it should be a calculated risk only. So therefore, all those new technologies have to be developed so that bottom of the truth could be reached. Due diligence, at least it should show to the government I have done the due diligence, actual substantive due diligence, number one. Number two, the government and the regulator put together, they have to now formulate the policies and accordingly reformulate the laws. Because of this lack of clarity, we will suffer. Some line has to be drawn at some place. Now, is this company, why company is purchasing asset from X company? X company may have done anything wrong. The wrongness is not involved in the asset. Wrongness is in the intention of the earlier company who has done or in his action. Asset is an asset. Cash is a cash. It does not have a color. Color is in the person who is having it or the intention of using it. So therefore, after a line is drawn, whatever punishment is to be done, it should be done to the wrongdoer, not to other persons. So some kind of clear parameters should be made in the law, so that because of lack of guidance, regulars do not overkill, and ultimately businesses are not destroyed. Third comes the role of the courts. Though Honorable Justice Kothari is there, but I would say one thing, I would not hesitate in saying this thing. Earlier, the courts used to have requisite infrastructure and intention to evolve the law, to create new laws as is needed by the society. I don't know what has done, unfortunately. Some kind of following has started. I mean, the race has started just to follow the other judgment or just to follow the government's policy. What is really needed, how the guidance should be given to the regulator and to the public and to the government, that effort is lacking. I don't know what is preventing, what is binding. Something is lacking because these courts are the real bone of the country. They are the real support mechanism. Because the government has narrow-minded, because when the law is made, they cannot encompass all life situations. So when the matter comes before the court is fully aware what is wrong, what is right, and in which direction one should go. I think that role the court should perform. I may be asking little more than what is possible, but without it, I'm sure we are not going into the direction that so many trillion economy which we are dreaming, it is not possible.
I may just add, with the permission of Mr. Anshul Jain. This,
Yes,
Mr. Taneja has very rightly put the question that unless the information about all these wrongdoings is put in public domain, the concept of due diligence will not fructify. Investors should do due diligence is one thing to say, but they should know in public domain that these are the things tainted. So we should not go for that. But I don't think there is adequate data available in public domain as of now.
Very right.
To facilitate this kind of due diligence. And as far as courts are concerned, we have problems of delays. But you are very right, Mr. Taneja, that court knows the difference between right and wrong. But they should have the opportunity and wherewithal and necessary inputs before them to prove right from the wrong or shift the grain from the chaff. That is what it is all about. Thank you.
Yes, sir. On that optimistic note and on that very positive note, I would like to conclude the session. I would like to thank you, Dr. Dash, Mr. Taneja, Mr. Vineet Agarwal, and last but not least, and the most important, Justice Kothari. Thank you very much. Justice Kothari, I would like to hand over back to you for your concluding remarks, and we can then hand it back to Avinash.
Thank you so much. Not more than 2 minutes. It has been a great, rather for me also, a learning experience. All the 4 speakers except me have thrown light on the very fine intricacies of these laws, and a very useful interactions taken place. And I think Mr. Taneja and Mr. Agarwal and Mr. Dash have rightly pointed out that not only the role of courts is required to be there, but executives and integrity of investigation and execution has to be there. Finally, the economies and all these laws and people will survive if the investments come in. if the business prospers, if the economy prospers. So I, as a chartered accountant and a consultant in my old days, would always prefer that industry should prosper. At the same time, the laws cannot be thrown to winds. The laws have to be implemented. If you show the integrity and honesty in the execution of these laws, investors will not bother, even if they fall in some traps, some cases. But if they are not sure about the integrity of your investigation and implementation, they will just hesitate. They will have the fear. They will have the confusion not to come. And that would be very fatal and very wrong for the economy. Therefore, to first you give birth to the baby, let it prosper, and then point out if it has any wrongs. But if you kill the baby in the bud, nip the bud, then you can't have anything. So the sum of all this is laws are good, implementation goodness is required, and a very transparent kind of implementation of that is required, so that the foreigners or the foreign investments which we require in abundance for development of economy has to be infused with that confidence, with our adequate public data and information in record, and our integrity of investigation shown to them demonstrably. Then only perhaps we can meet the very purpose for which these enactments are brought by the Parliament. So with these concluding remarks, I once again thank ASSOCHAM for giving me this opportunity to interact with learned people like you all. And I think a very elite audience was in listening to us. Some more questions may follow. I think this academics should go on. I wish that the persons whom we were talking about, the executive and bureaucrats and the persons of ED and IRS people, those were also very much part of all this learning experience. They should be there also. But their constant training on these laws by interaction of the all stakeholders like industry, investors, professionals, judges, whatever, should constantly take place. That is the right learning path which we should adopt. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir. Thanks a lot. So on behalf of ASSOCHAM, I would like to convey my sincere thanks to all the panelists. And now we will start the next session, which is fireside chat on is BAPS a panacea for double down taxation. So let me invite eminent expert for this session, Shri Rajat Bansal, Chief Commissioner of Income Tax, Central Delhi, Shri SP Singh, IRS retired, who has been with Indian Revenue Services for more than 2 decades. So, sir, I would request you to kindly initiate the next session. And I would request that all the panelists, if you could also just attend this session and grace this occasion. Thank you.
Thank you, Avinash. It was really a treat listening to Justice Kothari, Aswini Taneja. I'm a very old friend and erudite speaker. Vineet is an ex-colleague, so it's always a treat listening to him. And about Mr. Das, less said the better, because he has been my senior and he has been a guide to me, I mean, at many stages. It's always that whenever a seminar or conference is organized, normally the best part is kept towards the end. So this session, I mean, which we listened to, without doubt, I mean, it is superlative. It's awesome. And now to add to that, I have the great privilege of having a chat with Rajat Bansal. And Rajat Bansal doesn't need any introduction. I think the entire world is looking towards him because he has raised very basic questions on several issues, trying to ensure that the interest of developing countries in particular and other countries also are not jeopardized. The tax is paid in the places where they are due to be paid, where the economic activities are carried out by enterprises. Those are the locations where the taxes should be paid. But is it happening so? It's $1 million question. Not only $1 million, it's $1 billion question. Because in 2012, when the BEPS program was launched, at that point of time, the total amount of tax avoidance or flight of capital or flight of revenue was something like 100 to 240 billion US dollar. That's way back in 2012. Now that figure must have quadrupled. And yes, it has, in fact. At that point of time, I mean, when BEPS report was prepared, it was a guess that the total value of revenue which is lost out is approximately 4 to 10% of the global corporate income tax revenue. Now look here what has happened in 2019. The UN has come out with a study, and it very clearly brings out that something like 31%, I would underline 31% of potential tax, which goes even up to 73%, is not paid in the jurisdiction which is actual claimant or bona fide claimant of the revenue. And that is why this BEPS has been there. But how far the BEPS has served the purpose? And one of the issues which is bothering everybody is that, is it able to deal with double non-taxation? Is it focusing only on avoidance of double taxation? Now, how does the double non-taxation happens? Many a time, double non-taxation happens because of certain actions taken by a tax jurisdiction. To encourage flow of capital or services, certain benefits are provided. In income tax, our income tax law, there are a large number of provisions granting benefits. And suppose those flow from the jurisdiction where there is no taxation. Now that is double non-taxation. The second situation may be that there may be outright concealment, rather I would say illegal act on the part of the taxpayer. That also leads to double non-taxation. Now, if we read all these things in the present day scenario, when the COVID-19 has impacted almost every aspect of our life, the business is going down very fast. The revenue is also going down very fast. So the challenge is both on the taxpayer as well as on the tax authorities to maximize their revenue. I'm intentionally using the term revenue, both applicable to the firm as well as to the government. In such a scenario, there are certain actions which are being taken by the international organizations like OECD and the UN. And fortunately, we have Rajat, who has been involved in both the organizations and the actions taken by them. So I will not like to lose any further opportunity or any further time. And I would request Rajat to brief the audience about how this phenomenon of double non-taxation is being dealt with at the international level. Over to you, Rajat.
Thank you, sir. A very good evening to everyone. And first of all, thanks to ASSOCHAM for having this 17th International Conference and having this topic, which is, I haven't seen this topic being taken up in any of the conferences in India so far. A kind of one should compliment them for choosing this topic and with this catchy line that is BEPS a panacea for double non-taxation. Now, SP sir has already set the stage for discussion on this interesting topic. Now, I think it will be in order first to talk about the what is double non-taxation and basic ingredients of double non-taxation, what it is and what does it entail. Now, double non-taxation in simple terms for cross-border transactions would mean that an item of income is taxed neither in the jurisdiction from where income is derived, that is the source jurisdiction, nor it is taxed in the residence jurisdiction. So as we can all see, it leads to a tax arbitrage or a tax advantage. And there is an opportunity here for tax planning, tax avoidance, or tax evasion, whatever one may call it. So obviously, this has been something which has been under the focus of international organizations like SP sir mentioned, the OECD mainly, and as to what is to be done with it. So let us first talk about what kind of situations or how double non-taxation can happen. So one situation can be that under the tax treaty, the source country has ceded its right to tax a particular item of income. And the residence country also does not tax it under its domestic law. So I'll give you two examples for this. Firstly is obviously the Mauritius case before the amendment of the treaty in 2016. Before that, what happened under the treaty? There was no the taxing rights over capital gains on sale of shares were allocated to the country of residence exclusively. And now Mauritius also enacted MOBA, Mauritius Offshore Business Activities Act, due to which the income was not taxed in Mauritius also effectively, although there was some statement that it's 3%, then some tax credit, but ultimately there was no tax. So this was a situation of double non-taxation. Other example would be of Gulf country treaties where there is no tax, and under the treaty, the tax rate is reduced. The source country has curtailed its taxing right on various items of income. For instance, under the UAE treaty, there is 5% tax on the bank interest, and there is no tax on the interest in UAE. So there is a situation of double non-taxation. And for several other items of income, same situation is there. Next case is where there is no tax on the income in the source country under the domestic law. It is exempt. And under the treaty, there is a tax sparing clause, which, as per which the residence country also does not tax it. So we had several treaties had tax sparing clause earlier, and that's why this will also be a situation of double non-taxation. Third would be a case where the characterization of the income in two jurisdictions is different, as would happen with the, for example, hybrid entities or hybrid transactions and hybrid items of income. Then in one country it is treated as interest, in other country it is treated as dividend, and maybe the entity's structure itself is treated differently in two countries, and that may lead to a situation of double non-taxation. Now, the issue would be whether all these situations are to be shunned, all these situations are bad. So the answer is no, because the treaties are entered into for several reasons, not only for avoidance of double taxation per se, or there are other objectives of treaties also, and it's a decision of countries to do it the way they want to. But when it transgresses the boundary of evasion and avoidance, then obviously double non-taxation is a bad thing. Now, one simple solution by one Professor Yona, who is a very famous person writing on these things, is that there would be no double non-taxation if every item of income can be taxed once and just once. And he doesn't say it, but it means that at the same rate, at the same base, all over the world, then there will be no double non-taxation. But obviously that will not happen because, as I said, the tax countries are sovereign and they reserve their right to deal with these matters as they wish to. And therefore, can be a wish list or maybe not even practical. So therefore, I think this is what I wanted to say about double non-taxation. And I hand over back to SP sir.
Thanks, Rajat. It's very nicely put. When I was listening to you, there are certain things which struck me. The most important is that are the global leaders taking measures to deal with this, address these problems? Is there any unanimity between the developing countries, because it was, as you rightly said, that to have one rate across the globe is utopian concept. It cannot happen because every country is driven by its own social, economic, cultural, and blah blah reasons. But now a lot of things have happened. If we look at the digital world, the things which used to happen over 10 years are happening, I mean, I think in weeks. I mean, we're thinking that there will be days when people will start working from home. There will be no office. That will be the fourth or fifth revolution, or the things like that. But look here what has happened. I mean, in 1 year, in few months, the entire paradigm has shifted. Now, that has brought in several issues to the forefront of the tax officers and to the taxpayers. Now, there are challenges which are being thrown by the digitalization of the economy. You are in thick of this, giving the proper right, to the proper extent, to the countries where these income accrues, arises, or and all those things which you will be able to share in a much better way than me paraphrasing. So why not, I mean, share with us how is the world, how is the international organizations dealing with the double non-taxation, particularly in respect of digital economy?
Thank you. Now, digital economy issue is not about, it's not exactly about double non-taxation, but as you all know, the inclusive framework is talking about two pillars, and there is a pillar 2 also. And pillar 2 is something which is linked to double non-taxation in a way. I mean, there is talk of a minimum tax to be paid by all the MNEs, which is talked about under pillar 2. So there are the discussion there is about what I mean, it's not, as I said, it's not directly linked to in any manner to digital economy, and that's a political call because as you know, when we have started talking about allowing taxing rights to market jurisdictions for in respect of digital economy, then it is not acceptable to certain countries, obviously, which will be losing revenue on this count. And they have put up conditions of their own, and it's a political negotiation where things have been tagged along, tagged together, though they are not exactly linked together. I mean, as you can see very easily, that we were talking about the taxation of digital economy and granting taxing rights to market jurisdiction. And now we are also talking about simultaneously about pillar 2, which is about having a minimum rate all over the world for incomes of multinationals. And the two decisions are linked in a way and are on the negotiating table together. And the outcome in one will influence the outcome in other. So this is very, I mean, I find nothing unusual about it. I'll not use the word wrong. I will say nothing unusual about it because after all, the decision making in international tax is also political more than anything else. And naturally, if it's a give and take, and therefore this thought has come up. So very brief, because we will be talking about BEPS and double non-taxation in this session, in this short session. So I think I'll not get into the details of taxation of digital economy, which is a whole session in itself. So back to you, SP sir.
Thank you. I think we are running out of time, and I think we have a couple of minutes for rounding up. So what is the conclusion in respect of the various aspects of double non-taxation? Which are the key points which you would like to underline?
Okay, so yes, because the question put to us was, is BEPS a panacea for double non-taxation? So let me very briefly touch upon the aspect of BEPS project and how did it address the double non-taxation issue. Now, BEPS project has, as you all know, 15 action points, and there were several action points which are having impact on the aspect of double non-taxation. Firstly, action 6 has inserted a preamble in the tax treaties in the OECD model and UN model, which explicitly refers to the objective of treaties being not to have no taxation through tax avoidance or evasion. Please mark the last words. It's not on its own that the preamble is talking about double non-taxation or non-taxation being a bad thing. It's talking about it in a context. And preambles have a very important role in interpretation of treaties. Therefore, this insertion in the preamble will have a effect on interpretation of treaties in future which have the new preamble. Then we have inserted the LOB and PPT clauses, which are both are targeting, like one is targeting the ownership structure. So if there is a treaty shopping intention through a jurisdiction which has no tax, then LOB rule will come in play, and PPT is of more general kind. Now, action 2 was about neutralizing the hybrid mismatch arrangements, and those situations do need to lead to double non-taxation. So several solutions are provided there, which are also followed in Pillar 2 in respect of digital economy. There is overlap, or kind of Pillar 2 is kind of follow-up of, I would say, action 2. Then there was action 5, and that's about the work on forum for harmful tax practices, where two important aspects I'll very briefly mention. The first is the start of transparency through exchange, compulsory exchange, spontaneous exchange of rulings. Suppose one jurisdiction has given some rulings in respect of a case, and that was leading to a non-taxation and that in that jurisdiction. And now with exchange of those rulings, the other jurisdiction will also come to know what has happened, and maybe it is in a position to check the double non-taxation. And other was a review of preferential regimes in respect of geographically mobile activities, through which again the aspect of non-taxation of certain kinds of incomes will be checked. So quite a bit has happened in BEPS project to check the double non-taxation. And finally, I will say that what is it that can check double non-taxation effectively? We have been having a subject to tax kind of clause in our tax treaties from before. Recently, one can look up the India-Chile treaty, which has been signed in 2020. And in the article on limitation of benefit, there is a paragraph which is saying that unless the item of income is effectively taxed in the other jurisdiction, the treaty benefit will not be granted in respect of that item of income. So that does not link itself to proving of any kind of abusive or avoidance situations, and directly attacks the double non-taxation aspect. So that perhaps is one solution to check the double non-taxation. But maybe all jurisdictions will not be interested in it, because, as I said, double non-taxation is not always considered to be bad, and it depends on the objectives of different treaties. So I'll stop here because we are running out of time, SP sir. And yes.
Thank you. Thanks, Rajat. Over to, I mean, it was a very, I know that time has put some restrictions, but you were fantastic in covering the important issues on that. Maybe in future, I mean, some other day, we will have more time to discuss all these aspects. Yeah, Avinash.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rajat sir and Singh sir, for your valuable inputs for this program. Now, let me invite Sri Rahul Garg, Chairman, National Council on Direct Taxes, to give concluding remarks and key takeaways. Rahul sir.
Rahul, unmute yourself.
Good evening, everybody. And I just want to congratulate SOCHM in doing the COVID workshop spread over the 5 days, 4 days, the 4 sessions of 90 minutes each. and participation from panelists and our audience. It has been fantastic, from tax policy to the practical aspects to the litigation, the certainty, and also the aspects of digital tax and Panacea for BEPS and the looking forward for the tax trends. Everything got covered in those 4 sessions. I would just take 10 minutes time and try to do a roundup of takeaways from all those 4 sessions that I had for myself. And some of it might resonate with you as well. So the first thing on the tax policy, my takeaway was that the tax competition, given the situation that governments are needing to attract more and more capital and talent, the tax competition is going to stay. And in India, the action taken for the corporate tax at 15% manufacturing, I think that was a master stroke. At the level of the individual tax, there is something more to be done, both in terms of the rate of tax and also to consider the territorial basis of tax, particularly to attract the talent and also the investors from overseas who want to be in India for a longer period for their investment to be safeguarded and nurtured here in country. The second thing on tax policy I thought was very clearly visible, that the tax avoidance, the tolerance for tax avoidance is going to be virtually zero. And therefore, it is much more important for the businesses to consider where possible to attain certainty from the prior rulings or private rulings wherever possible in India or overseas. The next trend in tax policy, which was very apparent, was the adoption of technology. And the adoption of technology puts us all in a very new situation of being able to present your point of view, to evidence the things and make the assertions in a manner which can be self-explanatory, unaided. And that's a big, tall task. We have the limitation of language, we have the limitation of systems, we have the limitation of accounting, whether it is done in SAP or in other ERP systems. And given all those limitations, and given the way we have used the second language of writing in the tax matters in particular, I feel there is a lot for industry and business to gear up to maintain their contemporary documentation in a manner that it is explainable or explanatory, unaided from your being present to explain it, what does it mean. The next trend, which was very apparent, is that everybody is very keen to evolve global consensus. And you can see the passion with which Rajat sir explained how the double non-taxation or the work at BEPS or Pillar 1 or Action Working 5, etc. is happening. But still, it's a long way to go. The timelines have been set, likely to be met by December 2020. On digital tax, very, very unlikely. And given this, the unilateral measures are going to stay. Some you are facing, some more businesses may face, and therefore it's important that such unilateral measures are factored, but it shouldn't be considered that multilateralism on tax is over. I think multilateralism in tax is progressing, albeit with some hurdles, and this is one of the hurdles in that regard. The substance requirement is taking center stage from the interpretation, from the judicial courts, and also in developing the new legislation. And therefore, looking at the substance as a way of life becomes important. So in respect of tax policy, these are the 5 takeaways for me, and maybe some of this is useful to you. In respect of digital tax, again, the commitment to align with the global consensus was very apparent in multiple discussions with the people who are or have been at the center stage of this. But till such time that happens, should we keep waiting? And the answer to that is no. And that's what brings in some of the legislative changes in respect of the digital tax. The aspect that the digital tax of equalization levy coexists for fee for technical services and royalty for the first year seems unintended. But let's see if there is a clarification or amendment to that effect. Watch for it, that the double taxation, meaning subjecting the same transaction for FTS as well as equalization levy for the year 1, is that intended? It looks that it is unintended, and there may be an amendment to that effect. One thing though is very clear, that till such time global consensus is evolved and the taxation is done in a manner that people can offset their home country tax liability out of the taxes paid in the host countries, this is going to push the cost of the services to the recipient. And in this time today, when we are wanting to do the efficient economic revival for the country, how good is that from a public policy perspective, not necessarily as a tax policy perspective, is a matter for consideration. But suffices to say that the businesses should factor that directly or indirectly such cost is going to be pushed till such time the provider or the payers of such levies get a tax credit in the home country. In respect of the aspect of the certainty in the turbulent times, one thing was very clear, that the courts are changing the way they look at the disputes. And Mr. Pramod Kumar did mention that in 5 years from now, it was his crystal gazing, the courts would not look at the words alone, not even the intent alone of the law, but also at the public policy in the context of the larger public policy, what the tax policy is in giving the rulings. And that is important for us as businesses and tax administrator to see that how far are we congruent to the public policy, which is necessity for the economic revival. This also brings another interesting facet, that the jurisprudence accumulated so far over last 100 years is going to have limited meaning and limited use going forward if the courts start looking at it differently. And therefore, the way the tax people, both the tax person, the taxpayers in the business, and the tax administrators today work at some of these matters would require a rethink and change in mindset. Another aspect is due to lending certainty for the businesses, numerous processes, whether it is advanced ruling or APAs or private rulings in other countries, are gaining more and more momentum. And what happens in each of those activities, lot of very confidential information gets shared. And as Rajat was mentioning, that gets shared across the borders. The rulings that you take in other countries get shared across the borders. The submissions that you make virtually for your transfer pricing get shared across the border. Now that kind of confidential information becomes highly vulnerable, not because of any intent or defect or design of the policy, but just because so many people across the globe are handling. And we have seen what happened in Panama leak or HSBC leak or investigative journalism. And all this information, just imagine, for a highly profitable and highly growing company, if such information comes in public domain, what happens to his valuation? What happens to its business? And therefore, to my mind, even at the cost, if you could negotiate with the tax regimes in various countries to gain certainty, to contain the information exchange with limited number of the tax authorities, with limited number of the people, please do try that. It's a cost worth it, because the cost of otherwise vulnerability on confidential information is very, very high. The other thing which is very apparent is that the automatic sharing of information and also the linkage of the information exchange amongst the various agencies, both the private agency, banks, financial institutions, and various government agencies, is going to overload each one of them with tons of information of the variety, kind, color, shape, and size, which people haven't seen before. And just imagine when you are having such heaps and heaps of information available, which are very purpose of which information in that manner to be submitted or to be presented was driven by various purposes, of which a person, a regulator, a business person would have very limited knowledge. And in that context, when people start using that information or start viewing the outcome of the process and decision making that they do having regard to such large amount of variety of information, the kinds of dispute that would arise in future would be very different. And therefore, the suggestion here, particularly to the businesses, the takeaway for me was that please have the consistency as a process driven in your business using technology, and also linkages with what happens to your guys in the legal department who write something to RBI, whether you are making this payment to download the software, or whether you are making this payment to pay for technical services, or whether you are making this payment to buy the software, or whether you are making this payment by way of royalty. What does your legal guy write to RBI versus what does your tax guy write to the US authorities where GST becomes available, and what does the tax guy write to the Indian authorities when 195 certificate is to be applied? Now, if you don't have a process to deal with the factual matters in a consistent manner, it is very likely that without being wrong anywhere, you will be deeply, deeply embarrassed when two people put it together. The last thing I would say is that use of the artificial intelligence in relation to some of the decision making is going to be much more prevalent going forward. And therefore, when you look at your own information and use those algorithms as to what assertions does it give to, it would be very instructive to see what you may see in a store for your own information throwing back at you when regulators in various countries and agencies in various countries look at it. We had this session yesterday on the restructuring, and today, given the business circumstances, the restructuring is the order of the day. People are wanting to sell off the business, buy the businesses, change the activities, change the supply chain, change the human resources, outsource the things which they were doing insource, insource the thing which they were doing outsource. All these restructuring, we were very clear from that takeaway was that SAR has to stay, GAR has to coexist, PPT would also be there, MLI would also be there, and substance requirement would also be there. So please consider them all when you look at the restructuring, besides considering how many dollars or what percentage of contribution it will make to your profitability or to your bottom line. The last session that we had on PMLA, Benami, black money law clearly was indicative. To me, it looked like as if I, being an ordinary person, going into a machine room where any of the machine can start without notice. And you can't even imagine that an ordinary transaction done in such a good faith that I needed to buy property and I asked my brother-in-law to buy it, and therefore it became Benami, and therefore I'm in soup. I needed to buy a flat, and that flat happened to be somebody who is against the PMLA, and that is the UB guy, and therefore my flat, I needed to fight a battle for 7 years to get it to myself. Now, these are the kind of things where the machine starts without notice, and therefore you need professional help. And the most difficult thing is you don't even know when to need that professional help. And therefore developing in-house capacity to be vigilant and be able to see and sense these things would be very, very important, was my takeaway from this session. That's all for this. And if you all felt that this conference could have been improved, please do write to SOCHM, the Secretariat of SOCHM, and we would try to make it better next time. Thank you very much. And thank you, the participant, particularly for this session, who co-chaired it with me. Over to you, Avinash.
Thank you very much, sir. Thanks a lot for this very informative key takeaways. And with this, now we come to the end of this 4-day session. And I would like to thank all the panelists, all the speakers, and all the attendees for participating at this session. And as conveyed to you earlier as well, we will be submitting our post-conference recommendation, which will be submitted to Finance Ministry as well as PMO. So within a week, we will be submitting this. And with this, now let me thank all of you, and we will just conclude the session. Thank you very much, sir.